All right, this is going to be just a quick video version of Introduction to Clinical Supervision. So I'll start with going to Psychobabble Word Finder, and I want to introduce you to a few words that the guys who were making up the language of psychiatry were using about 120 years ago. They were mostly Austrians, and anyway, they created all these words, and we just need to know about two or three of them at the moment. First one is transference, and it went a bit like this. My client, she comes in to see me, and she is very hostile towards me. For no particular reason, I have been very pleasant towards her, but I think she is transferring her feelings and her thoughts and emotions from another onto me. It is her transference, it is not my clinical practice. However, for her, my counter-transference, even though she is hostile to me, I react to her as if she is the most lovely person in the world. Now, I know, it's wrong to be doing naughty things with your clients, and this is why I ask you, my trusted colleague, my trusted, esteemed fellow psychotherapist, that you give me clinical supervision for my practice, because I want my client to be safe, I want my clinical practice to be safe, and of course I want me to be safe also. So will you please give me some clinical supervision? That's where the word came from. Now, it's not unusual for nurses to be exposed to things that keep themselves, their clinical practice, and their clients safe. When I started nursing in the 80s, there was an AIDS epidemic at the time, and they introduced what was called universal precautions. They've since been, I think, mid-90s, they changed the name to standard precautions. But at the time, it was new, where you treated the urine or feces of a nun who was 80 the same as you would the urinal feces of somebody who said, look, I've been running around having unprotected anal sex with everybody in town. You used universal precautions, you treated all body fluids as if they were potentially infectious. And it's a new idea, not everybody got it straight away. We got it because we were introduced to it as nursing students. We didn't know any other way. But I know that that took a few years for it to kind of really stick in the health sector. In the 1990s, they introduced a no-lift policy, and they did that for a couple of reasons. It was really good to look after nurses' backs, but also it was really good not to drop patients on the floor. And so it seemed really unlikely when they first started talking about it, because the hospital I trained at, 900 beds or so, I'm pretty sure they only had 2 or 3 lifting machines. And so when they first started talking about it, I was like, oh, good luck. But anyway, lo and behold, with a bit of a nudge from the unions and a lot of goodwill from our employers, that's become the thing, the no-lift policies. Here in Queensland in the 2010s, we got ratios. Again, it's around keeping clients safe, keeping nurses safe, and keeping our clinical practice safe. And I'm really hopeful that now we're in the 2020s, we're going to do what those psychotherapists in Austria did 100 or so years ago, and we're going to introduce clinical supervision for all nurses and midwives, no matter where they're working. Why would that be important? Well, this is a really grim part of the presentation, and I'll try to use my mouse to point out the bits that I'm talking about. So this is Australian data. It was published in November 2016. It's looking at data of suicide of health professionals between 2001 and 2012. So a couple of things to point out here. So here, boys are blue, girls are green, as we all know. Male doctors kill themselves at about the same rate of males in other professions. Allied health professionals who are male are a little bit protected by the sounds of things. Their suicide rate is a little bit lower. Males who are nurses and midwives, their suicide rate is a fair bit higher, which is a bit of a worry. Let's talk about the females now. Female allied health workers do take their own lives at a slightly greater level than people in other jobs. Female doctors at about twice the rate of people in other occupations, and female nurses and midwives at about 3 times the rate of people in other occupations. So this is a big deal. We do need to protect ourselves, just the same way the no-lift policy protects our back, and universal precautions or standard precautions protect us from infection. We've really got to do something about protecting us against psychological damage from the emotional labour that all nurses and midwives do. Right, so get away from that really dark thing. Gather round, children. Uncle Paul's going to tell you a story. once again, about 100 or so years ago, this time in Wales, not in Austria, the miners who were working in coal mines in Wales said, look, all well and good to have a job, but at the end of my shift, I have to trudge down from the mine back to my little miner's cottage, and using my hot water, I've got to wash my overalls and have a bath. And, I try to ask the wife to help out, but she's busy with the kids, and it'd be great if she could heat up the water for me. And there's an argument every day, and it's a real pain in the bum. So it would be really good, instead of doing that, if I got cleaned up on the boss's time. And the mining bosses weren't all that keen on the idea, of course. They'd be like, oh, no, it'll cost us money. But anyway, eventually, I think there's after strikes and after a fair bit of action from the unions, they finally gave in. And now it's part of the just standard practice for all mines in the Western world that I know of anyway, that you have pit head bars where at the end of your shift you take off your grubby overalls and you dump them there to be laundered. You get washed up using the hot water of the boss's time. You get cleaned up, and then you change into the clothes, and then you leave the mine site and you're all cleaned up. You will remember the Beaconfield miners who spent 2 weeks underground after it was announced on TV that they'd been released from that terrible predicament that they were in. It still took a long time for them to get to the surface, because they stopped off on the way up from the mine to shower and shave and change clothes. And then when they finally got to the top of the mine shaft, then they clocked off. Kind of amazing, right? So getting cleaned up on the boss's time was built into the infrastructure of that mine in Beaconsfield, as it is, as far as I understand, into every mine. What's that got to do with nurses and midwives? Well, we don't get covered in much coal dust, but we do knowledge-based labour, we do skills-based labour, and we do emotional labour. And clinical supervision seeks to address that. This little diagram here is by a lady called Bridget Proctor. She's one of the rock stars of clinical supervision. And it's from her publication back in 1986 called Supervision, a Cooperative Exercise in Accountability. So it's a really nice idea that you've got somebody to help you be accountable for your practice, but you're getting guidance around that. And Bridget Proctor described the 3 primary functions of clinical supervision. So the formative is where you acquire new knowledge and skills, and you might even get to the chance to sort of discuss those skills and even practice those skills in clinical supervision. Normative is about keeping our practice safe. So we've got plenty of policies and procedures and guidelines and codes of conduct and upper expectations and all that sort of stuff. That's all about keeping us safe. And so if we start straying beyond any of those guidelines, clinical supervision is there to kind of pick that up, or hopefully so you don't overstep the mark, and to bring you back in line with safe clinical practice. And then the restorative part of clinical supervision, the bit that I value the most, the mental health nurse values the most, is about addressing the emotional labour that we do. And we will experience transference and counter-transference at our workplace, and we will have really sad things happen and amazingly joyous things happen at our workplace, and it'd be really good to sit down with a trusted colleague and discuss them every now and again. It's interesting, I love AFL Football, and I barrack for the Adelaide Crows. The men's team has been quite hopeless for over a decade. Actually, I'm overstating, but anyway, look, the women's team's far, far better, and they won the 2019 grand final. And if the women's team is anything like the men's team, they spend much more time practicing their skills and having team meetings and keeping fit. So they would spend hours and hours and hours a week to prepare for 2 hours of play every weekend. It's a kind of amazing mix when you think about how much input goes in for those elite level sports people compared to their actual performance time. For us, of course, in nursing, it's quite the reverse. We're performing usually 40 hours a week and might not have all that many hours tucked away where we get to develop our skills and recover and think about what we're doing. And that's part of what clinical supervision is doing. It's just taking an hour or 2 out a month to intentionally reflect on our practice with some trusted others or other, and try to make our performance a little bit better. Just out of interest, in the middle there, I'll point her out, she'll hate me for this, that lady's called Denny Van Hagen. I might have mispronounced that. Apologies, Denny. But she's a nurse at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and I met her once, and my sister-in-law works with her. Anyway, you might be thinking, we can't afford to spend money on nurses and midwives just sitting around talking and thinking and reflecting on their clinical practice. But really, when we think about the patient safety and our own safety, I don't think we can afford not to. Clinical supervision isn't a particularly new idea in psychotherapy. They've been doing it over 100 years. The psychiatrists I work with, it's kind of built into their practice. Nearly all the allied health people, particularly social workers, psychologists, I think OTs, and maybe physios, I'm not so sure about them, they have clinical supervision kind of baked into their clinical practice. And it's just that nurses and midwives, we were born in the church, raised by the military, we never really got around to thinking about looking after ourselves. But we've seen that suicide data, now's the time to do something about that. So, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Since 2009 in Queensland, we've had these clinical supervision guidelines for mental health services, which recommend clinical supervision for all staff members, including nurses. And not every single mental health nurse has taken it up, but those of us who have found a lot of benefit in it. And I'm not sure if you saw, but in April 2019, the College of Midwives, the Australian College of Midwives, the Australian College of Nurses and the Australian College of Mental Health Nurses put out this joint position statement around clinical supervision. And they're saying clinical supervision should be available for all nurses and midwives, no matter what level or what position that they're in. So it's pretty exciting that that's come to that. And I think, from what I've heard, there's some information that's sitting with the Office of the Chief Nursing and Midwifery Officer in Queensland, and there might be something coming out, maybe this year, that will be talking about clinical supervision for nurses and midwives. And I'm guessing it'll be an amalgamation of the content of those two documents, the Joint Position Statement and the Mental Health Statement. So the infrastructure's there, we can pick it up and run with it if we want to. There's been some great work done. This is by those three colleges. They've put out this terrific poster which describes effective clinical supervision. It's really worth having a good look at that and some other resources. I've put together what I've called cheekily a starter pack for clinical supervision. That's available at this website, or if you've got your phone handy, you'll be able to go straight there by using that QR code. And you'll be able to pick up all the resources that I've spoken about in this pretty rushed and breathless presentation. Thanks for listening. That'll do for now. And I hope this clinical supervision works out for you as it has for me. Cheers.